Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. Thank you for joining us in this new format where we continue to bring you authors you love and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. At any time during this event, you can click on the green button below to purchase tonight's book on Politics and Prose's website. We're currently offering free media mail shipping. Our physical stores are closed and we need your online purchases in order to keep bringing programming that Politics and Prose is known for. Also, I'd like to draw your attention to the Ask a Question feature below, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can ask a question there for honor, and you can also read other people's questions and vote on the ones you'd like to hear the most. And also a reminder that unlike our in-person events, the author, the host, and the audience members cannot see you, so feel free to stay empowered and stay in your pajamas without judgment. Finally, we'd like to thank all of you for being here with us tonight. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers, keeping our business and our spirits afloat. And now I'm honored to introduce Honor Moore. Honor Moore's new book is Our Revolution, A Mother and Daughter at Mid-Century, a memoir of her mother, Jenny Moore. She began her writing career with Morning Pictures, a play about her mother's final year, which was produced on Broadway in 1974. Moore's other nonfiction includes The Bishop's Daughter, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, LA Times Favorite Book of the Year, and a New York Times Editor's Choice. Also, The White Blackbird, a life of her painter grandmother, Margaret Sargent, a New York Times notable book. The first of her 3 books of poems has just been reissued as a classic collection, and Women's Liberation Feminist Writings that Inspired a Revolution and Still Can, co-edited with Alex Cates Schulman, the Library of America, will appear next year. She lives in New York City, where she heads nonfiction and teaches in the MFA writing program at the New School. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Honor Moore to Politics and Prose Live.
Thank you, Tom. This is my beautiful book. I'm so sorry I'm not going to be there to actually sign it, but I virtually sign it to all of you, and we'll meet someday in the future, and I can actually sign it. Washington was my mother's home for some of the most extraordinary years of her life, and she also died in Washington in 1973. I was thinking as I was waiting to go live that 51 and a half years ago, my mother was on a book tour for her book, The People on Second Street. And that was at the end of the toward the end of the tumultuous year of 1968. And of course, this year is a different kind of tumultuous year suddenly. And I somehow feel that she's present, that she had a kind of powerful, intuitive leadership capacity, and she would have put it to use at this time. I'm going to read just a tiny bit, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. The woman who comes to me in dreams is not my real mother, or she is my real mother now and has been since she appeared in that bright green field. I was 27 and she had not yet died, but would within weeks. The green of the field was so vivid. Mom! Mom! George has lost his sneakers and Danny wants to be hugged and Susanna wants to show off her pet snake and Patience is crying and Rosie is off somewhere and Marion is late coming home from pottery class. Let's go hear Peter, Paul, and Mary tonight, she announces to no one in particular. She goes out onto the back porch. How she loves this climate. It's never too cold. And rings the bell for supper. Is Dee upstairs studying? Is my brother Paul out playing tennis? Maybe my father is on his way home from the cathedral, or maybe he's away. Many speaking engagements these days. And she has to call Charles E. Johnson Jr., the carpenter, to fix a broken window. Mom, don't scream, Georgie had written on a torn piece of paper she pastes in the scrapbook the following summer. I was playing balnetto in the front hall and broke a pane of glass in the front door. I am living for the first time at a distance from the family spectacle, the news arriving in the letters I've saved that she wrote me at least once a week, in the intermittent diary she kept in scrapbooks and bursts of recollection from siblings. Her diary, this is about 1964, went to Georgetown, wildly successful time with decorator, did living room and dining room, made blackberry pie. And then a dinner among Washington luminaries. Of one couple, she's really an aggressive jerk. Bartlett's very nice. All columnists are such gossips, they'll tell you anything. JFK felt he was going to be assassinated, used to joke about who would stand in front of the bullet if killer approached. And my parents also gave their own dinner parties. Tonight, the Bradleys are coming for a late dinner. Her childhood friend will become managing editor of the Washington Post in 1965, executive editor in 1968. Now he's still editor of Newsweek. Interesting people are always turning up. The poet Reed Whittemore arrived to take up residence at the Library of Congress. Later, this position would be called Poet Laureate. And with his wife, Helen, and 3 children moved in across the street. I am going to have to revise my idea of how poets live. They have a pet rat called Templeton and a skeleton in the front hall with a flower in its mouth and a hat on. And through friends in New York, they met Rick Haynes, African-American and working the Africa desk at the State Department. Diary, African parrot who says ladybird, shit, and freedom now, she wrote about dinner there. All African art, Benin bronze, modern Tunisian water pot for lamp, African fur rugs. He was about to leave for Leopoldville. It was almost November, the first year they lived there, when she could write me, finally, I'm no longer homesick, and her friend Pam, that their new life was a utopian existence. As I got older, my mother often suggested I was grown up enough to call her Jenny, but I couldn't. In mommy or mom was her tenderness. And all these decades later, the word revives her vulnerability and mine, and the moment in my first year of college when a revolution began in our relationship. Though I wanted to be an independent college girl, I needed her, and she knew that. Always remember, she wrote more than once, we love you very much, the parental we. I think of the early Washington years as a time when my mother and I were in balance. You might say, well, what was out of balance before that? What was out of balance before that was your normal sort of adolescent oldest daughter with 8 younger brothers and sisters trying to figure out who she was, which was not going to be a mother of 9 children like her mother, but a writer like her mother also was becoming, or had become by then, had published a book by then. The revolution really was me becoming a writer and her becoming a writer, her coming into herself, as she put it. I had always been a we, now I was an I. She was in a process in writing her book, in letting her voice be an I, first person singular voice, of becoming not a we that was a wife, not a we that was a mother, maybe a we that was part of a growing movement in this country, but an I. So you ask, why writing a book about my mother, how many years after her death? Almost 50 years after her death. She left me her unfinished writing in her will, calmly sitting there, and there were jewelry and paintings, and then suddenly she's leaving me her unfinished writing to do with what I see fit. Well, I had actually just gotten my first poem accepted for publication. And as I drove home with those 6 or 8 cartons of her writing, I thought, you know, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to do her writing, or am I supposed to do my writing? And what I did was my writing, immediately starting to write poems about her dying, which became the play Morning Pictures. I went on from there, but I had this tug to these boxes of her writing, and once in a while I'd look at them. I didn't know then, and I really thought about this just this morning, that it was really grief, still, all these years later, that kept me for years, for decades really, from looking really intensely at her writing. And then I published a book about my father, the bishop's daughter, and people kept saying, "What about your mother? What about your mother?" And I would kind of inwardly groan because I couldn't be rude to these people. And I would think, I already wrote about my mother. But as time went on, I realized that I had written about my mother when I was in my 20s, when I was in grief about her dying. And now I was at that point in my late 60s, and my mother died at 50. So if she just stayed 50, I was old enough almost to be her mother. And I'm not a mother, but I am a professor of writing, and I am a writer. And, you know, I've written more than she wrote. And so, I don't know, it all muddled around in my head. And I thought, well, I'm going to do this. Now, you have to write a proposal when you start to write a book. And my proposal, I didn't know what the book was really. I knew that I had to get out of the grief and the kind of feeling of sadness I had about her loss. You know, she said when she was diagnosed with cancer and she'd published one book and she'd gotten herself, she and my father had separated and she was leading an independent life, taking classes at GW, going to Johns Hopkins to study fiction. She said when she was diagnosed, everything was just starting. And it was that sadness that everything was just starting that really was within me. And what I can say is that an extraordinary, Alfred Kazin, the critic, once said to me, the most amazing thing about writing a book is that you're an entirely different person when you finish it than you were when you started it. And I've actually always found that to be true. And in this case, the person I am is a person who has resolved her relationship with her mother, who lost her mother at 27 and has her mother back in a way. And in that way, I can say that it's really a worthwhile project to look back, as Virginia Woolf said we should, through our mothers. As women, we look back through our mothers. And because what I discovered that my mother, whom I had thought of a melancholy person, because of course she was melancholy when I last knew her when she was dying, but she was actually a joyous, buoyant person. You know, let's go hear Peter, Paul, and Mary, or one of my sisters said to me, she said to her, you want to go demonstrate with Malcolm Boyd down at the Pentagon today? And Marion said, sure. And my mother said, you might get arrested. And my sister said, no problem. You know, that's what she was like. And there was just this kind of buoyant openness to her. So the question really was, how did she go from being a Bostonian daughter of a kind of old Bostonian families in a very sheltered, suffocating world to a real progressive, a woman who really changed during the process of her life. I look at my table of contents. The first chapter is called Fretwork, and that's a quote from her. She says she was never comfortable in the fretwork of her mother's art and Dutch tulips. And so you have this sense of her stuck in a fretwork, but nonetheless, she's lively. She writes poems. She pretends to be a tomboy, you know, she pretends to be a boy. She is a tomboy. She does an arabesque on her speeding bicycle. She wins blue ribbons riding horses. And then the second chapter is called the Diana Cup. And that's the moment when that's a chapter about her coming into her own as something between a girl and a woman. And we discover her as a competitor, you know, winning a women's race, winning the Diana Cup, being the first in her family to go to college, going to Vassar and then Barnard. At Barnard, taking an anthropology class where one of the subjects under discussion, I discovered in all my research, was race, race relations. It was a very dark time in the history of civil rights during the World War II. There were riots, and but race was becoming, you know, a conversation. And she studied that at Barnard. And my father is known as the great civil rights activist, but actually it was my mother who tugged him along to understand that whole part of this country. The third chapter is called Persuasion, because you know, people say, well, what was the most unexpected thing you found doing a book? And the most unexpected thing I found was 2,000 pages of letters between my parents, their entire courtship carried on by mail, boxes. You know, they got Xeroxed, and, you know, I have 4 volumes of my mother's and 4 volumes of my father's. And so I'm able really to tell what my young nieces are calling a rocky wartime romance in their own voices. And the persuasion is not one talking the other into something, but it's things falling into place, and the two of them really deciding they had something to offer in this post-war world. Then I have a chapter called The Size of a Coconut, and that's, you know, she said that a bomb has gone off in Japan, and it was the size of a coconut. Of course, it wasn't the size of a coconut. In any case, this explosion at the end of the war lands them in Jersey City, the inner city in Jersey City, and near where On the Waterfront was filmed. And that's where I spent my childhood. So I spent my childhood in what was then called a slum. Now it's gentrified. It was essentially an old neighborhood, which was a home to workers and sailors who were coming in to work in Jersey City. And the church had died, and it became a kind of, under my parents and 2 other priests, a vibrant community center. But, you know, although my mother loved this work, there was a moment, and this surprised me. I, as a feminist, as a contemporary feminist, I would have said, sure, she must have wanted, you know, she must have been sick of, you know, making all the soup for the people at the door and doing all the laundry and not having very much help and having one child after another. But I didn't really know that. And that was the gift of having her voice. Another surprise after the 2,000 pages of wartime letters was that sentence I think I quoted earlier. I've always been a we, and now I am an I. That's what I thought. That's where I thought she was getting to. But miraculously, after 40 years of rereading these papers, there it was. I think what I'm not getting across, or maybe I am getting it across, but there were so many papers and so many photographs and so many years of scrapbooks. I was endlessly photographing scrapbooks and endlessly going through my papers, and then I was teaching, then I was going back to this, and then I would write a paragraph and a page, and it was a struggle to find the shape of the book. And it's a kind of writer's thing to say, but I really do believe that books find their own shape and guide you to it. And to my surprise, various things I have always believed as a woman writer who began writing in the early 70s in second wave feminism, that an amazing thing happens if you put a woman at the center of her own story, for instance. She's not a mother. I mean, she is a mother, she is a wife, but she's also a person. So it's even an exercise for me as a feminist writer to wrench my mother into her position at the center of her narrative. And that process for me sort of mirrored the process of her life. The title of the book, Our Revolution, was arrived very organically. I thought I had all kinds of arty names for the book, like for a while I called it An Unfinished Mother. Another time I called it Raven Red because that was her lipstick color. And she had black hair and was kind of a raven. And my editor said, well, that sounds like a poetry collection. Okay. But I didn't know what I was going to call it. I knew I was always going to call the last chapter Revolution, because what happened to my mother was she was in a near fatal automobile accident. She almost died. She had 2 months in Washington Hospital Center thinking about her life, struggling to have her life. And then my father was elected Bishop of New York, and she moved to New York way too soon after recovering from the accident. And she kind of collapsed from exhaustion, ended up in a mental hospital, which was her worst fear since her mother had been in and out of mental hospitals. But she emerged from all of this, and she returned to Washington, an independent woman writer, and she began to make a new life. And so that's her revolution. Meanwhile, I was having my revolution in the sense that I too, while I wasn't sheltered in this same way my mother was, but I was 23 and 24, 22, 23, when women's liberation was starting, when the second wave feminism was starting. And so I was kind of being forced to confront possible difference in my destiny than I had imagined. And my mother and I really came together on that. We started, our war, another title was The War with My Mother. There was a war with my mother, but by this time the war was over. There was definitely a treaty, and we were definitely having serious talks that were leading us to a new relationship, the relationship that I got to have actually writing the book. And I remember the day that I came up with this title, and I thought, I was just thinking, the way one does, oh, she's a revolution, I had a revolution. And then I had the word revolution as the title of the last chapter, and I had scribbled hour in green ink above it. Oh. And I was working with some friends. We're all in the Adirondacks, and one friend came in and she said, have you given any more thought to the title? And I said, what about Our Revolution? And I knew that it was the title. I mean, this is the way it's always been for me, that titles sort of come like a poem comes, or like an idea for a book comes. But luckily, unlike a book, they come whole. And so that sort of gave shape to my revisions on the book. And that's what brings me to this moment and my mother. I got, we're all getting all these emails, and I got this video from Austin, Texas. And it was a series of very beautiful images of the empty streets of Austin, Texas. Just, I don't know, I lost track of how long it was, maybe 90 seconds altogether, but it seemed very long, and you're taken deep into the solitary emptiness of these streets. And then it's, that part is over, and there's a kind of call, and it says, "This is not the end of the world. This is not the end of the world. This is the greatest moment of solidarity, the first the first moment of worldwide solidarity in the history of the world, in the history of humankind." And that's the perspective that I like to have on this moment. And I like to think that my mother would, well, she'd be wild about Zoom. Let me just say, she would have pulled in every one of our now 40-member family for, some kind of reunion. I'm just trying to think if there's anything I've left out. I know that, I know one thing I did want to bring up, which is that I feel very grateful historically, if you can feel historically grateful, that I live in the era of life writing, in the era of the memoir, in the era, this change in narrative work that allows one to write a kind of hybrid book like mine, which has a kind of novelistic vision, but is nonfiction, but also has poetic parts, by which I mean parts in almost poetry. And so that's one thing. And also that allows me to tell the story in the process of the book, of writing the book. I have a moment when I say, I have more quote unquote serious moments, but I have one in which I say, "I've been trying to get my parents married for months." It's just, I never thought I'd get through those 2,000 pages of letters. But I think it really is that idea of interactivity with this form of life writing and memoir writing that has allowed me to get my mother back. And I'm really, really grateful for that, because in a certain way that means I have myself back, that self I lost in my late 20s when she got sick. I'd love to take any questions people have now.
Thank you so much. That's really powerful and really fascinating. We don't have any questions so far, but I just want to draw everyone's attention. I know. Everyone, there's an Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions for Honor about her book or about her work, please type them into the Ask a Question box, and I will ask them to her. Also, if you haven't already, please purchase a copy of Our Revolution from Politics and Prose. There's a green button there, and it looks like we have a question. Okay, this question comes from Jeff. We often have memories of memories rather than memories of actual events. In your research, did you discover that many of your specific and meaningful memories were wrong?
Did I discover memories were wrong? Not really wrong, sometimes incomplete. I'm sort of fortunate in that I have found, the big wrong thing was that I thought of my mother as having had a life that sort of led to its end of her death from cancer. And so that's kind of this old-fashioned idea of a tragic trajectory. But in fact, she had a life that was, as I say early in the book, it's a triple rainbow. She was going forward. It was a thwarted life. It wasn't a depressive life. So that deep memory, which really informed my whole life, was wrong.
We have a lot of good questions coming in. Sharon asks, Honor, can you tell me what your siblings' response and their families have been to your book?
Well, so far, people haven't, because of the virus, shipping has been a little slow. So I can say that I've had wonderful, excited responses from various of my siblings and from just two or three of the next generation, of whom there are 30. There are nieces and nephews, and then there are grandnieces and nephews. And they are so excited to get to know her. None of them was born when she died. So, and the book is actually dedicated to all of them. And so far, they're really excited to get to know her. And they say things like, well, I kind of knew some things, but this really fills it in. Or I didn't, like one of my nieces didn't realize that not the 9 children were planned. They were members in good standing of Planned Parenthood, and we were meant to be every 2 years. And we are more or less every 2 years, and she never knew that. So there are things that maybe the older siblings knew that the younger ones didn't know. And then I had a surprise. My brother, Paul, there's a temper tantrum I had on a hike in Northumberland when I was 14 and we were on this family trip. And I think of myself as totally alone in my fury. And he said, oh, of course I remember the drama in Northumberland. So that's interesting that maybe I wasn't alone as I thought.
Okay, we have a question from Catherine. She wants to know if you think you'll ever go on to another life writing project.
Well, these books have come out every 12 years, sort of on the dot. And so I don't think I can do another 12-year one. I think, I'd be 86 in 12 years. So I do think I'll do other life writing projects, but maybe shorter ones, maybe a different form. And I also want to return to, I have a book of poems that's almost finished, and I want to return to that.
Okay. Rita asks, what is the most important thing that you discovered about yourself as you came to the end of this remarkable memoir?
Discovered about myself. I had this thing of my mother. What I discovered about my mother was she always picked, it's called resilience. Of course, now we have a name for it, but, sort of pick yourself up, dust yourself off and start all over again. I sort of thought that was my Scorpio, sense of renewal, but I now know that actually I inherited that was modeled for me by my mother. And so that's really a great gift. And also that just the pure thrill of finishing a book. These books are so hard and take such a long time, and you never think you're going to finish them, and then you do. So that is a kind of great ego booster or confidence booster. For all you writers in the middle of books, keep going.
Claire would like to know, how did you decide to structure your memoir as a hybrid? Did you outline key moments or write out memories in a linear way?
I wrote sort of what I call clusters, sort of emotional clusters, memories. I wrote tons of those. And they're not all in the book. Then I had seen this Currier and Ives poster that I write about in the beginning of the book, in which there's a kind of issue of the woman's life cycle. She's a child, she's a baby, she's a child, she's a teenager, she's married, she's 19th century. And one of the things I sort of began to learn is that women's lives seem to be, the book has 8 parts. There are 8 little books, you know. The Bishop's Daughters seemed like one big book. This was 8 smaller books. So after a while, I began to realize that it was sort of chronological. And I I know people say chronology. Some of my students have had teachers who say chronology is your enemy. Well, actually, I don't think it's your enemy. I think it's, or they say not your friend. I think it can be your friend. I don't mean to say that every book should be chronological, but, in a book like this, one thing leads to another, and certain things happen because the thing before happened. So, and I think especially for a woman living in a time of change, she was sort of out there, making her way. And so that, does that make sense? Is that I didn't purposely structure it, but because I always begin with these images and these scenes, but eventually it just pushed its way into that. And by the time I wrote the proposal, I did call it a kind of memoiristic, both a memoir and somewhat biographical. And the other element was that I had all my mother's unfinished writing, and I decided to weave that writing through the book. So the text is my writing, but there are italicized portions of her writing that could be as short as 2 words or as long as a page and a half. So.
Okay, I have a question for you from Lorna. She asks, your mom was such a powerhouse. What do you think she'd most like to be remembered for?
I think maybe I think because she died when she did, she probably is remembered as this person who had this wonderful house and all these children and welcomed everyone and asked hard questions and told the truth. I think if she'd lived longer, she would have wanted to be remembered as a writer. And she actually was a writer. She wasn't a person who wrote. One big discovery was that she'd written really coherent poems and prose ever since she was a child. So when she began to write her book in the 60s, she was returning to something.
We have another question from Claire. She would like to know, what kinds of memories do you feel you can represent better in poetry than in prose, and vice versa? Why so?
Gracious. Well, I think there's a kind of, much of my poetry is erotic and speaks of intimate moments. And I think sometimes those moments don't work in a memoir, especially if it's a memoir of somebody else. On the other hand, I do use images in the memoir much in a way that I use them in poems. You know what? I think that, Claire, I think you're going to, whichever Claire you are, I think you're going to have to write something about that and send it to me and let me know what you think about that.
Okay, we have one from Sharon. She asks, how did you decide what to leave out?
You have to often in the material that you have, there's material that duplicates a characteristic or a kind of moment in the subject's life or in the life of the story. So you don't want to duplicate those moments. So I left out the duplications. What else did I decide to leave out? it's a process of getting it lean, getting the text lean, more than it is parts of her life that I would leave out. I mean, there were people alive whom I was discreet about, but I don't leave, if I need to reveal something in order to tell the story, I will reveal it, but I am discreet. I try to abide by sort of the values in that regard of my mother, who was, who burned certain, destroyed was the word she used, destroyed certain papers before she died. So there may be a whole other part of her life that I know nothing about, that I left out because I didn't know it.
We have one last one here from Brady. He'd like to know, do you wait to start writing until you feel you have all your research done, or do you write and organize your research simultaneously?
I do it simultaneously because if I do all the research, I could research things that I don't need, or I could not research things that I do need. So I have to, it's very unpleasant and uncomfortable to be in that conflict between should I research or should I write. But I think it's just, I think it's just how it is. So I do both because I want the book to show me what I need. For instance, I had to read my mother's account and read an oral history that I found about the McCarthy campaign and about what happened in 1968 in Chicago. She was in the Hilton with the McCarthy campaign. And so I didn't really know that that was there to the extent that it was. So I had to research certain details of that time that I wouldn't maybe have known to research if I had done all my research first, for instance.
And one more has come in. Rachel would like to know, have you been back to SWI since 2016? And she attended your session then.
SWI. Southern Women's, I don't know what SWI is, so maybe she could give you that. And in the meantime, there is a question that people often ask, which is, how was this writing this book different from writing about your father or writing about your grandmother? And I would say that the main difference was that my mother died in 1973. So I had to do a kind of excavation of that era and of myself in that era. And in the case of my father, he had just died when I started that book, and I had been thinking about him intensely for 25 years. And with my grandmother, I had started to get to know her and get interested in her right before she died. So this was different in that way because it was an act of excavation. And also I had so much material of her voice to integrate into it, which I didn't have in the other two cases.
We have two more here. Real quick, Rachel says it was the NYS Summer Writers Institute.
The New York State Writers Institute? Yes, I go back there. I went there for 20 years and I'm going this summer, God willing.
Excellent. Okay, so two more questions for now. Gail wants to know, you kind of answered this already, but she wants to know if your siblings shared your memories and interpretations of your mother.
Well, what many of them have said is that it stimulated their own memories. And one of the things I've learned writing about my father and writing about my mother is that, and teaching nonfiction and memoir writing, is that each sibling has a different relationship with her or his parents. So that being the case, conceivably in this case, there could be 8 books or 9 books. The differences are, you know, yes, they shared some memories and others they did not share. I was very grateful. One of my sisters actually gave me a note she'd gotten from my mother that I include in the book, and I was very grateful for that. So that was a kind of real concrete sharing.
And then Catherine asks, I was so struck by your sadness at leaving Jersey City. Where do you consider home now and why?
Where do I consider home now? I consider home now New York City because it seems that I've lived in this apartment for 20 years, which is the longest I've lived anywhere in any one space. And I had lived in New York from 69 to 84. So I've lived most of my life here and I was born here. So I guess I consider this my home, although I don't leave out the possibility that I could have another home. I may be the kind of person who has different homes at different times of her life.
We have it's more of a comment from John Marquise. He says, you impressed me when we met in junior high. It was so hard for you moving to the conservative Midwest from Jersey City. Through high school, you were a force of nature to be highly respected. Dad worked with your father at the Shortridge Human Relations Council. I am looking forward to reading another of your books. It's from John.
Well, he was known as Mike then, and I did have quite a crush on him in 7th grade and 8th grade. 8th grade.
Claire asks, many of us know who your mother is from having attended GWU classes under her scholarship offering. She continues to make a wonderful and lasting difference in the lives of writers. What is the legacy you wish for yourself as a writer, and how is it like your mother's?
I'm so glad, Claire, that you brought up that the Jenny Moore writer in Washington. My mother left her royalties from her book and some money of her own to support young writers and artists in Washington. And that has become the Writer in Washington, which is resides at GW, and which after 2 or 3 year hiatus is starting again in the fall. So that is a great legacy of hers, and I think it's a legacy that really expresses who she was. You know, this opportunity for people who are not in universities to take a free workshop with a known writer in the community. And Edward P. Jones and Dorothy Allison are both graduates of that workshop, and people like Marilyn Hacker and Tayari Jones and many other writers have taught in that program. So that's a great legacy. My legacy, I don't think about it that much. I do hope that my work survives, but I'm actually not so good about that. I mean, I just want to keep writing, and I do teach, and that's important to me. My mother had 9 children, and I've had, hundreds of students, and that's very important to me. To give to students maybe what I didn't feel that I got as a student learning to write.
And we have John Mike Marquise with the last question. He wants to know, he says, similar to you, my grandmother was 18 when her youngest brother was born. Can you tell us a little about your relations with your siblings and what directions they have gone?
Well, my youngest sister is 17 years younger than me. We have 4 psychotherapists in our family. We have one sort of person who works with people with wealth to invest that wealth in sustainable and progressive enterprises. There's one painter. There are 3 writers. There's a little overlap with the psychotherapist. One of them is also a writer, my sister Adelia. And my sister Rosemary is a playwright. My brother George, whose drawing you see on the wall behind me, is an artist who lives in Mexico. We go through stages of being very close and stages of being not so close. And at the moment, we have these weddings of the children of my siblings, and that seems to be a gathering place for us. It's quite a mob, it's about 40-something people. So I don't know what to say about that, except that my mother would be pleased. I dedicate the book to, to the next generation. It's a block, a paragraph of wonderful names.
Okay, well, I think that's all our questions. Oh, wait, one more. One more just came up. Marion says, what did you learn about your mom's relationship to the city of Washington?
The city of Washington was her deep home. It was the home she made. It was the home where she was beginning her new life, and she felt supported and nurtured by Washington. She loved the climate. She loved the informal street life in Cleveland Park. I think she loved her house. It was the place where she had her first house that didn't belong to the church. So it was a place where she made a home for us and with us, and then made an independent home of her own. And so it's a very precious part of her life, and which is why I'm happy to be here at Politics and Prose. Please buy the book.
Yes, please do. There's a button at the bottom of your screen where you can purchase Our Revolution from Politics and Prose. We really need your support right now, and it's a really great read, as we heard earlier. Honor, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Well, thank you for having me, really.
And thank you all for joining us. If you want to follow more events, you can click follow at the top of your screen to learn about all of Politics and Prose's events. And at 6 o'clock, we have Richard Lazarus, who's discussing the Supreme Court. And once again, thank you to Honor, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having me.